Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay in the back there? Yeah? Somebody in the back? Raise your hand if you can hear me. Yeah, that's better. Okay, thank you very much. My name's Kevin McLaughlin. I'm the Dean of the Faculty here at Brown. I'm also a faculty member in the departments of Comparative Literature, English, and German Studies. I'd like to welcome you all here, I guess also in my official capacity as Dean of the Faculty. On behalf of the university. I'd also like to take just 1 second to thank Adi Ophir for continuing to move this very interesting project forward with energy and creativity. And I'd also like to thank Kit and Trauda and the wonderful Kogut staff and the hospitality from Kogut. Should also thank the Kogut director, Amanda Anderson, who's also one of our participants. So I'm just going to introduce the three speakers in this first session, and then I will step aside and let them deliver their papers, and then I will be happy to recognize questions and comments afterwards. Our first speaker is Judith Butler, who's a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, who will be speaking on the concept religion. Our second speaker is Patrice Maniglier from the Université Paris-Ouest, Nanterre. He will be speaking on materialism. And finally, Monique David-Ménard at the Université Paris-7, the Institute for Cultural Inquiry, who will be speaking on the concept of conversion. So let me turn it over to Professor Butler.
Let me first say that I'm enormously pleased to be here, and I want to thank Adi Ophir and his staff and the entire political concepts group for inviting some of us to join on this occasion to converse with Etienne Balibar and to honor him and his extraordinary work. I assigned myself the topic of religion. Why? My immediate problem is this one, which is that I don't think religion is a concept. And perhaps it's important to say that within the field of religious studies broadly, there are active debates about whether religion should be treated as a concept, and hence philosophically, or whether religion is a set of practices, rites, rituals, histories, texts, modes of reading, social forms of life, and ought properly to be understood in another way. So, for instance, my very good friend Henk de Vries believes that it is a concept and ought properly to be treated that way, and my very good friend Saba Mahmoud says it certainly is not. Okay. So, there we go. In Balibar's early work, Spinoza and Politics, I believe written first in 1985, is that correct? Spinoza and Politics. Okay. In the early 80s, he follows a complex and compelling trajectory through Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico-Politicus and the Ethics to show how a political structure of democracy is articulated through the reflections on religion, specifically on God, law, nature, and love. Spinoza is said to lament the degeneration of religion into superstition on the one hand and dogmatism on the other. Further, he seeks to distinguish both theology and theocracy from what he calls true religion. Balibar begins his text by claiming, and this text, Spinoza and Politics, by claiming that one can find the contours of a theory of democracy in Spinoza's Tractatus, one for which actions or deeds prove to be central to both faith and freedom. Balibar follows Spinoza closely as he seeks to understand how true religion differs from theocratic notions of institutional authority and its command structures. What does true religion mean when it is not only separated from theocracy, but functions as a critical perspective on its operations? And how is true religion related to freedom, understood as potentia, the immanent power of the individual that is irreducible to egotism or individualism? Clearly opposing the mandates of religious institutions that seek to curb the operation of free thought, Spinoza seeks to know and elaborate the very power of free thought, an inquiry that involves rethinking power, not merely as potestas, external power, but as potentia, immanent power, and rethinking freedom, not as individual prerogative, but as an exercise of power crafted and intensified in relation to others. Theology is faulted politically for its deep ties to hierarchy and caste, which is why defeating one ruling theology by installing another is no solution, simply shifting the site of potestas while failing to reverse the priority of potestas over potentia. The radical critique of theology would have to take aim at the social hierarchy between the so-called elect and the masses, those it governs or subordinates. All this happens through recourse to a critical method that, in Balibar's language, and I quote, frees faith itself from theology, end quote. And though I cannot, in these few minutes, reproduce the subtlety of Balibar's exposition, I do hope to underscore that this faith, liberated from theology, is not a merely subjective experience, but, alas, true religion. True religion restores and intensifies the immanent powers of freedom, ones that are exercised and actualized in the context of interaction or communication with others. If we move too quickly to the conclusion that that freedom has been successfully transposed now into a form of social exchange, we forget that Spinoza identifies the will of God associated with true religion with nature itself, nature in its totality and its necessity. For Balibar, this apparently speculative problem of understanding how the will of God can be so identified with nature is to be approached less as a metaphysical problem than as a practical one. In what sense or where is something called God operative in nature and true religion? And how are they then related to one another? As Balibar points out, the philosophical problem that Spinoza confronts is how to relate human freedom to the order of the world. If both freedom and nature are ordered in some way and related to one another, then that can only be understood by seeing how they both act. If faith shows itself in works, then any theocratic authority that intervenes in acts seeks to negate the freedom or potential expressed or actualized in those acts. If freedom is figured apart from acts and works, and if faith too is said to exist apart from deeds, then both are wrenched out of the structure of action that gives them meaning. Even as it is the task of the sovereign to determine the public good, according to Spinoza, the sovereign oversteps its mandate if it interferes at the level of deeds and works, thwarting their emergence or curbing their expression. Deeds and works, then, are expressions of what Spinoza calls the freedom of religious conscience, I'm trying to understand whether the French conscience is consciousness or conscience, and I'm going to choose conscience even though we know the true translation. And it is that practical determination of faith that constitutes true religion. There are checks on the sovereign and checks on the individual, and those limits articulate a sustainable bond. The individual checks her own freedom in transferring her own sovereignty to the external sovereign authority, which means that both sovereign and citizen are bound by practices of self-limitation, even though overstepping and interference happens or threatens to happen all the time. As Balibar elaborates the nascent structure of a democratic theory found in Spinoza's theological writings, working always between the Tractatus and the Ethics, it becomes clear that consensus, for instance, is derived from faith, and that faith, or potentia, is the practical and social determination of freedom, close, we might speculate, to Marx's idea of living labor. Something is alive in this potentia, enacting and exposing its relation to what is living in nature, to the animate order of nature, an order that is manifest less as principle than as conatus. That actualization of what is living in nature is what links human freedom to the order of the world. It also explains why theocracies that deny or destroy true religion are, in Balibar's words, essentially sad. If and when true religion is suppressed, the living basis of the polity is destroyed. This is why the effective absorption of religion into theocracy is the death of religion, and precisely not its actualization. The success of theocratic rule, the triumph of potestas over potentia, destroys the very possibility of the determination of an action at once free and social, defining one version of tyranny. Conversely, there is something in religion that subverts theocratic rule. This may or may not be a fully deliberate or conscious strategy. As Balibar, following Spinoza, puts it, and I quote, "There is a tendency already present within religion itself to pervert its own aims," end quote. In other words, there is something in religion that resists its realization as the structure of a state. Its aim is less teleological than practical, or at least it should be, and its institutionalization is in some sense its death. Although I cannot lay out all the links of this argument, an argument that Balibar continues in a piece published in 2012 entitled Spinoza's Three Gods and the Modes of Communication, given first, I think, in 2009 at Kingston, if I'm not mistaken. It is at Birkbeck, okay. It is worth noting that Balibar finds that God takes several forms for Spinoza, some of them quite surprising. There seems to be recourse to God as anthropomorphic sovereign, but God is also rendered distinctly as law, detached from all anthropomorphism. This happens when God, or the divine, is said to be love, but also nature. These latter renditions lead Balibar to emphasize the ethical and political implications of a practical form of freedom that is always co-determined within and by a social and political world. The point is not only that the conatus, that desire to persist in one's own being, is enhanced or diminished depending on the dynamic interactions with other living beings, but that a desire to live together, a pulsation that belongs to cohabitation, emerges, that forms the basis of consensus, and that this political principle and practice follows from the very exercise or actualization of the desire to persist in one's own being. One desires to persist in one's own being, but that can only happen if one is affected by the other, by others, and so without that fundamental susceptibility, there can be no persistence. That's my little addition. This is the point that Deleuze partially clarified about Spinoza. but the political implications exceed the Deleuzian view. If one's own being is implicated in the being of others, then persisting in one's own life implicates one in a transitive situation of supporting and being supported by the persistence of another's life. My life is never exclusively mine, since life itself is a transitive relation. This persistence in one's being, which turns out to be constitutively linked with the entire order of social and natural life, is, moreover, not a substrate of action, but action itself. Since the desire, understood as a power, a potential, is acted upon and acting. In the 2012 essay, Balibar redefines Spinoza's God this way. The absolute meaning of God is the idea of agire, acting, and agency, and more precisely, of acting absolutely. As I understand it, no God stands behind this kind of acting as a metaphysical phantasm. Whatever God is operative in that acting. We are not led to ask, then, what grounds the metaphysical justification of God. We ask only whether and where and how this notion of God becomes operative. If what is called God proves to be an immanent feature of socially determined and free action, and that action is enabled and intensified as part of an exchange, then action emerges within a field in which the living body is acted upon and acting upon others, sometimes sequentially, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes in ways that do not allow us clearly to distinguish between active and passive modalities. This transitive field of acting and acting upon is one way of describing the operative domain of true religion, according to Spinoza, transitive in the sense that it passes over and incites. It is, in fact, this potential that is socially generated on the basis of the transitivity of the conatus that constantly contests the idea of God as sovereign law-giver. I think it is fair to say that for Spinoza, God may give the law in the form of command, but no sovereign may fully intervene upon the conatus and its actualization in action without losing its legitimacy as a sovereign. The command is issued, but whether or not action complies with the demand, the command, is not predictable. Such a formulation not only foregrounds the possibility of an embodied and social freedom, it also exposes the sovereign as less than all powerful. You know, maybe the sovereign is just full of blustery rhetoric calling foreign leaders in the middle of the night. We don't know. We don't know. That's the best case scenario. Sorry. The political unconscious. This last point becomes all the more clear when we learn from Balibar that Spinoza tends to identify God with law, and specifically with the site of enunciation whereby law is communicated. At that point, the anthropomorphism of God falls away, and in its place emerges the performativity of law-giving. The law is given in a situation in which obedience is not precisely secured. Indeed, if God is the law, God is also, it seems, love, which names the social dynamic and generative character, the character of the conatus. One might say that in relation to law and to love, the operative moment of God is the performative. We find both features in Spinoza's work, which means that in his work we also find the textual theater for the mutual contestation of law and love. Now that dimension of God called love, the Deus sive amor sive homo, once again leaves the anthropomorphic conception of the divine in elaborating those affective relations among individuals freed from all ambivalence. This pre-Freudian account of love, a love freed of hate, centers on the mutuality of acting and loving, or perhaps better, the transitive generation of love at the expense of hate. At one point in the text, the idea of God is understood as precisely this middle region, if not that middle voice, where the actor's love is not altogether distinct from the lover acted upon. The augmentation and intensification of both passions depends upon a way of acting and being acted upon that is not easy to distinguish. On the one hand, it sounds like Merleau-Ponty's The Intertwining, that unedited piece at the end of The Visible and the Invisible. But given that this love scene is now called True Religion, it might also be closer to Martin Buber's Between Man and Man, the divinity in and as the relation, perhaps calling on Jacques Lezere's elegant presentation yesterday. What is most timely, however, is the idea that true religion is to be found in that affective and loving relation among humans that, in Balibar's terms, saves them from their unhappiness. In Spinoza, we do find Balibar on the topic of happiness and sadness. Love acts upon others, but love also is realized or actualized through works which intensifies the potentia among humans, linking their lives to the living and natural process of the conatus in ways that cannot be fully determined by any commanding or exterior law. Indeed, what Balibar calls the practical rule to love thy neighbor, the one which, of course, struck Freud as so improbable, why would we not be more prone to have hostility as our first relation to the neighbor? That relation to the neighbor has a saving power. The argument follows neither from utility nor from any other measure of instrumentality. As Balibar puts it, to love one's neighbor performs its own result, generates its own intensity and enhancement, more fully actualizing true religion and even happiness. It also builds the rudiments of civil society that is not yet or not ever subject to external law. There are, of course, many complex problems here, including the psychoanalytic argument that there is a constitutive ambivalence in all relations of love. One reason why, Jay, the mother is no guarantee that one will have a deep-seated sense of dignity.
Touche.
And the sorry. Okay. Among the complex problems besides the mother are various political insights into multiplicity and antagonism within political life that we find in democratic theory throughout many centuries. Since I cannot take all that on right now, I wish only to return to the critical relation between true religion and theocracy in Spinoza's text and in Balibar's reading. If theocracy is an attempt to destroy true religion, and true religion moves beyond various anthropomorphic and anthropocentric conceptions of God, this puts Spinoza, not surprisingly, closer to the Jewish tradition than the orthodoxy of his synagogue would have understood. At the same time, he takes up the Christian doctrine of love. Love may not be the basis of civil society, but it may articulate some of its basic structures. The multiplicity of desires ideally enhance one another within the context in which no repressive law, no command structure intervenes upon their realization. One can see how Spinoza became the inspiration for anti-statist politics on the left. My final question is whether this important framework elaborated by Balibar in his early and recent work functions in some way in his discussion of secularism and his proposals about how best to adjudicate religious claims within a state that defines itself as secular or laïque in the French sense. I will not here go into the various secularism debates, though it is important to note, as Amir Mufti has shown, that the secular in the work of Edward Said, for instance, is not the same as secularism in Assad. Okay, and I'll just state that because many confusions follow. I take that point, but perhaps we would do well to think about the process of secularization as it is variously formulated by Asad Mahmoud, perhaps also by Schmidt. In the study of religion, there is, as I mentioned, a debate about whether religion is or should be treated as a concept, or whether it needs to be understood as an embodied way of life, a set of practices or rituals, a matrix of subject formation, a relationship between texts and their interpretation. The idea of religion as a concept inserts the problem of religion into philosophical debate, transforms and readies the phenomenon for its place within a philosophical vocabulary. Whatever quarrel there might be between philosophy and religion is swiftly resolved when religion is treated as a concept. The history of its usage and meaning is at once presupposed and obliterated in that moment when it becomes consolidated as a concept. It does not matter which religion or which practices at the moment in which we arrive at the generalization that subsumes them all. The point is one that Koselleck made about conceptual history, and one that Marx himself made about abstraction, namely that the sedimented meanings of a term are covered over when it is transformed into a conceptual reality. Nietzsche's point was somewhat different, arguing in Beyond Good and Evil that concepts are the cumulative effects of dead metaphors. Indeed, at one point he says that only when the history of a thing is fully forgotten can it emerge as a concept. Similarly, secularization names the process by which religious categories are transformed over time into secular ones, and though the secular emerges as a moment of progress that leaves religion behind, it is itself defined by the religious traditions that produced its basic terminology. One of the great features of Spinoza's Tractatus is that it shows us the moments of those conversions without precisely covering them over. So if we turn to Balibar's consideration of those operations of arbitration and mediation used to negotiate among conflicting religious claims, we have to ask where this power of arbitration and mediation comes from. Is it a secular operation, the distinctively secular operation of mediating among religious claims, and is it itself outside or beyond the domain of religion? Spinoza refers explicitly to the secularization of many of the religious concepts that he analyzes in the Tractatus. In fact, that process of secularization articulates the possible structure of a democratic theory in that text. The enigmatic hyphen in the title, the theological political treatise, the enigmatic hyphen that joins the theological to the political never did quite tell us how to read that relation. In Balibar's recent work, including an article entitled La France aux laïcs, ? He explicitly criticizes those French cultural positions that take laïcité to be an identity. The mandate of laïcité for the state, Balibar reminds us, was to maintain institutional neutrality in relation to its citizens, establishing a rigorous separation between church and state. Laïcité has at least two meanings, one which insists that religion should not represent public power, but another derived from Locke and the focus of much of Balibar's own reflections, which endeavors to preserve the autonomy of civil society and in particular the liberties of conscience and the freedom of expression found there. In this light, the emergence of a laïcité identitaire, an identitarian secularism, appears as a contradiction in terms. Of course, one can maintain secularism as a set of personal beliefs or even as a self-proclaimed identity, even rally behind secularism as a personal and political cause, but those beliefs or that identity position belong to an indefinite number of beliefs that are or should be protected by laïcité. In other words, how can laïcité name that neutral operation of power that protects one's personal beliefs and also be a personal belief protected by that very power? On the one hand, if secularism names institutional neutrality, then it provides the possibility of mediating the conflicting views, including conflicting religious views. Secularism would not be one of the various liberties of conscience, including religious liberties, that it mediates. It would not be the same as the identities in relation to which it is charged with maintaining neutrality. When secularism becomes a civil religion or an identity position, a form of publicly avowed identity ready to fight with religious identities, or in the case of France, pitted against Islam, then it forfeits the very neutrality for which it stands and becomes one of the positions in need of mediation. Of course, all this becomes more complex if laïcité preserves the religious foundation of the state in Catholicism precisely by enshrining the Catholic-Republican distinction as the defining one for the understanding of laïcité itself. If the state is secular by virtue of not being Catholic, then Catholicism is negatively preserved as the defining religion for the state. Sorry. I have much to say on that topic, and much has already been written. Much has been written about this in relation to the Dreyfus affair, but the general point is that established forms of laïcité distinguish among religions worthy of protection and others figured as the force against which protection is needed. Talk about a potent way that tropes work within the political field. In conclusion, I wish only to point out that Spinoza himself avowed the secularization of the religious concepts he considered, by which he did not mean that the religious meanings were negated by the secular ones, but that the tension between true religion and theocracy formulated basic tensions between individual and state powers. For Spinoza, it was clear that the religious meanings continued to inform and shape secular concepts, even as secularism sought to separate itself from religious concepts and practices. Whether secularism reanimates certain religious traditions, even as it insists upon its separation, is, of course, of the utmost importance to people who hold strong views on all sides of the question. So one question I am left with is whether true religion, in Spinoza, limits theocratic power in the way that secularism is supposed to safeguard the religious neutrality of the state. Is the effort to separate religion from state already happening in the formulation of true religion? And if so, is true religion truly one precursor of what we now call laïcité, secularism? Is love not related to mediation, as it surely was for Hegel in his early theological writings? Further, the question of where and how to mediate among conflicting religious claims in civil society appeals precisely to a neutral party or a neutral site for that mediation. What and who is vested with the task of conflict resolution, and for what reason? What is this model of love without any remainder of hate? Is true religion then precisely a way of articulating civil society in its multiplicity, precisely the framework for mediating not only between religious claims, but the very conflict between secularists, conceived as identitarian and sectarian, and non-secularists, understood as adhering to any number of religious views or accommodating that multiplicity? If we thought that secularism is the name for institutional neutrality and neutral mediation, we might ask whether it is not the animated legacy of true religion. Thank you.
Well, it's hard to speak after Judith. So I want first to say that I'm very honored and even deeply moved to be here with you today, because my acquaintance with Etienne's work dates back from the time when I was an MA student looking for a supervisor at the ENS, and it was an impossible supervisor because I was working on Spinoza and Nietzsche, and I was told that it was impossible to find someone who would be interested in that kind of comparison in the history of philosophy in the French way, except that I was told that there was this very unlikely guy called Etienne Balibar that I should probably go and meet, which I did. And I wrote to him, but with fear and trembling, because I thought that my interests were very far from political philosophy. But he replied with enthusiasm to the project I sent, and I discovered that I had incredibly numerous, fantastic ideas, and which I hadn't, of course, recognized in my proposal. And you will have here recognized Etienne's generosity, I think. So this generosity is not just a moral attitude, it's actually an intellectual discipline. Right, and in fact the reason for that generosity in that particular case is also that Etienne was not a political philosopher, and is not, I think, a political philosopher. He's someone who considers philosophy as politics, in a certain sense, in philosophy in its entire gamut. So that takes us to my point today, which is materialism. And indeed, materialism is not just a concept, if it is a concept, and I will try actually to make of it a concept. It's not even a political concept. It is the concept of the politicality of concepts. It's a concept that says something about the way concepts should work in general. So we'll try to go through various forms of materialism in order to precisely try to craft a materialist concept of materialism, if you wish. Because there is a problem precisely with being a materialist and engaging in a conceptual activity in general. So first, the idea that materialism has something to do with politics might seem obvious to many of us, especially if you are familiar with Etienne's work and trajectory, since, of course, it points at the use Marx made of this notion and the uses that were made in the Marxist tradition, the notion of dialectical materialism in particular. But this link between materialism and politics is far from obvious. If you look at the entry materialism in the Britannica Encyclopedia, or in actually the Stanford Encyclopedia for Philosophy too, it does not even contain one mention of the word politics. Even in this context, however, materialism touches on the problem of concepts, because it is defined as a synonym of physicalism, and I quote, "All facts, including facts about the human mind and will and the course of human history, are causally dependent upon physical processes or even reducible to them." So all the words here are very problematic, and I will have to come back to them. So materialism would then be opposed to idealism, which would be, in one way or another, arguing in favor of the autonomy of concepts with regard to non-conceptual processes. This autonomy is a causal and explicative autonomy, which means that idealism would state that concepts can be causes, either because they can trigger other concepts, or because they can impact upon the non-conceptual realm. In other words, ideas can change things. Ideas can change the world. That's why they matter. Materialism, thus defined, however, encounter a rather strong problem. Indeed, it implies that the very idea that we are expressing when we utter this materialist creed is itself, according to its own standard, dependent or even reducible to some kind of physical process. The concept of physical is physical, playing with Spinoza, concept of dog. At least the work it does in the world does not originate in the concept itself, but in something else, behind or under it. There's a trope here. And if this is true, this means that the materialist creed simply indicates a particular physical situation. To investigate whether I should hold it or not, whether I should be a materialist or not, I should try to see whether I am in a situation, in a non-conceptual situation, that contains the kind of physical processes that could cause that materialist creed or not. And of course, that's not what materialists do. They try to argue. They try to produce concept. So they would be in a kind of performative contradiction, in other words. This argumentative strategy has been used by the idealist tradition since maybe we could say at least Descartes, and it became very fashionable, at least in the time maybe of Kant, and certainly after Husserl, and certainly in France under the domination of a certain kind of phenomenology. But you find it very clearly stated by Cassirer's introduction to the philosophy of symbolic forms, where Cassirer makes of Plato a critical philosopher, precisely because he's an idealist, that is, he recognizes the primacy of concept over everything else. Each time you engage in thought, well, you have started with concepts, therefore you should actually recognize the primacy of concept. I have no doubt that the tenets of the materialist creed could probably defend their position against that very common strategy. However, I would like to introduce here a second version of materialism, which itself not only is critical in the sense that it performs a sort of operation that I have just sketched, like that is drawing our attention to an unapparent or suppressed condition of possibility for the very action I am performing, which is a definition of what being critical means, right? So telling the truth about the very condition of the fact that I am telling that truth, something like that. So not only it's that form of materialism I want to introduce is critical, but it's actually critical of the very approach of critique that I have just presented, that is the idealist definition of critique. This version, of course, is the one that Marx and Engels introduced and illustrated in various ways. Their argument in favor of materialism is precisely that its opposite, that is idealism, is not critical enough. Why? Because it presupposes that to be critical is exclusively a matter of speculative or theoretical decision on action. You just have to fight your prejudices, basically. If you want to correct your materialist prejudice, well, you have to think about it again, right? Whereas they claim that there are some number of ideas, if you want, that can only be changed if you change the reality or the non-conceptual situation in which they happen. So something else than concepts. But this version of materialism also emphasizes the fact that the very possibility of having this discussion about materialism that I am trying to have with you is to be, it's to be found not in some presuppositions or prejudices, but itself in material presuppositions. So here I'm saying that if I had nothing to eat today in the morning, if I didn't have a bedroom to protect me from the cold, and if I didn't have cars to take me here, actually I came walking, but, well, I couldn't be here, basically, to have this conversation. So we can care for ideas as ideas because our lives are being taken care of by others or by ourselves, and very often, in our case, by others. So it's a famous Latin phrase, you know, primum vivere deinde philosophare. First to live, and then to philosophize. Althusser expressed that view very beautifully as a justice problem. He put it in a letter that was not published to Jean Lacroix, his professor, that philosophers receive their world, their entire world, and even the truth of their world, from their fellow human beings, and they just give them back concepts, which is okay, as long as they accept to share their language and their truth as they share their bread. This, I think, is actually materialism itself. This attitude, or this provocation somehow, is materialism itself. Bread here is just one name for those materialities, but gender, race that we saw yesterday, class, of course, diets, technologies, languages, and so many other non-conceptual conditions for the very possibility of engaging in a conceptual conversation are in this materiality situation. Well, this might seem trivial, and I think it's not, actually. It's very deep, and it's even about depth itself. So critical materialism says that thought comes second, that ideas come second. And this is exactly the way Lenin defines materialism, using Engels in his book Materialism and Imperial Criticism, where he says, for the materialist, nature comes first and the mind is second. For the idealist, it's the reverse. It's a very simple definition, and I think it actually captures the idea. So this, I think, is the materialist postulate, or the materialist attitude. And I would like to try to see how, or what kind of challenge, simply to think about that postulate or to make of it a concept, drive us into. So first, what I've just said means that to be a materialist is not saying something, it's not saying anything about what is to be thought, about reality. It's not, has nothing to do with the problem of realism. It's whether, for instance, it could be access through sensations, or whether it's made of non-conceptual realities like atoms or whatever, spaces, forces, whatever you want. In fact, it's to say something about the very being of thought itself, or about the very being of ideas. That is, of this element within which any claim whatsoever is made about matter, among other things. So, what is it to say about that? It's to say that it is determined, or rather, to use a word that Etienne has used, it's to say that it is heteronymous. It's the heteronomy of what we are doing when we are speaking of the heteronomy that is at stake here. It also displaces the problem in the sense that it changes the conception we have of the relation between being and thought, between what we are doing when we are engaging in a conversation about materialism and something else. The very idea that materialism might be an answer to a question about the object of thought is idealist in itself, and this is, I think, what Marx wanted to say to himself in the thesis on Feuerbach. So idealism is not only a claim about being, it's a claim about the relation between thought and being. And this is something that is really important today, because the speculative realism and speculative materialism has blurred those issues a lot, because they basically have an image of thought, as Deleuze would say, as representation. And what this, I think, is precisely what it is to be idealist, is to think that thought is concerned with being as a problem of representation, when in fact thought is concerned with being not in terms of whether it is represented well or not, but as that in which it is. So thought is embraced in something larger than itself, if you want, or something else than itself, that is not object-like. Which means that it's a problem of production and not a problem of representation. To think is to continue the production of the world and not to represent the world. It's to do something not only in the world, but actually to continue the world. Third point, materialism includes immediately a critical element in the sense of critique, where the critique is this operation I have first tried to describe. So here, materialism is not only a philosophical doctrine, it's actually a strong relativization of the very importance of defending such philosophical doctrines in general, since they can only be effects and never causes. Indeed, what could define philosophy as the activity of showing, of building, of assessing conceptual consistencies, that is, architectures of concepts that are linked to one another in coherent way, in various forms of coherence that you could imagine. So under that definition, I think it's actually a good definition of philosophy. It's a conceptual activity, and concepts are defined by the way you can sort of fold your experience upon itself by trying to redetermine concepts that are operated in your experience in relation to one another only. So to create that kind of systematic relation of concepts to one another, which is the very condition of possibility for concepts, in fact. So under that definition of philosophy, well, philosophy would get it all wrong since the very beginning, because it would think that you can do something with concepts. So it would be heteronymous in a radical way, in an immediate and definitive way. So at the very moment you formulate materialism as a philosophical claim, you call in question the very worth of doing such a thing, according to your own requirements. So here is our question. Is philosophy worth practicing, or is conceptual activity worth practicing or not, according to the materialist postulate? And also, what does the materialist postulate must contain in terms of positive claims, that is, what concept we should create, that would help us assessing the worth of philosophy? In other words, we need to build a particular concept, the concept of materialism, but at the same time criticize the very possibility of what we are doing. So this is what I think materialism requires from us, a way of producing a concept that is exactly equivalent to the critique of the very possibility of producing a concept. So the concept of materialism that we'll try to propose very quickly, tries to do that, to be at the same time a constructive activity and a critical activity. So my question basically is, why a speculative materialist is something to be? A working class hero is something to be, and a speculative materialist is something to be too, but why? That's actually a difficult position. So this speculative materialism must begin with the calling in doubt of the very worth, of the very importance, of the very validity, which I would prefer to say worth of such an enterprise. That is, it means that we have to start with the question, what would materialism as a practice, whatever that means exactly, that is, as something that is not entirely conceptual, that's all what we want to say here. So what would materialism as a practice, why would materialism as a practice need any conceptual clarification or speculative moment? Why would it need that? What does the concept of materialism make to materialist practices in general? Of course, the only way to answer such a question, which I think is a way of phrasing a materialist approach to concept in general, and to the concept of materialism in particular, the only way to answer such a question is actually to look at materialist practices and to see when and where and why and to what effect they have indeed met the necessity, or simply the effect, maybe sometimes the benefit, also the disadvantage of conceptual clarifications. So we can think of some cases in which speculative interventions have been made in the name of critical materialism and see how that works, basically. Just to name a few, of course, Marx would be an example, but I'm not going into that. Engels, when he invents dialectical materialism in his last books on Feuerbach and so on. But I would stop at Lenin on materialism and empirical criticism, which is actually a reflection about critical materialism. What is it to be critical? Yes, materialism has to be critical, but not in those sense those guys that he criticizes do. And in fact, Althusser would be another one, and Etienne, of course. But in fact, I won't have the time to go through all those interesting people. So first, on Lenin, on materialism and empirical criticism. This book is clearly a very speculative book, if you have read it, which deals with the most speculative issue you can imagine, which is the issue of the things in themselves. You cannot do more speculative than that, right? So why does Lenin, in 1908, right, between the two revolutions, feel the necessity to respond to those philosophers who try to find foundational ground for materialism in what is in Mach and Avenarius, in this Austrian school? Well, in fact, he says it very clearly at the very beginning. He says, because those Marxists proceed fearlessly, I quote, to downright fideism. Fideism? 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 Fideism. Fideism. Fideism? I don't know how to pronounce that.
Faith.
Well, yes, faith. In fact, he uses that word because censorship would not allow clericalism. And he wanted to say clericalism, and this is interesting because fideism, which is a word that Quentin Meillassoux uses, anyway, is more speculative. Is more like if it was a doctrine, whereas clericalism is clearly to do with the church, in fact, right? And this is what is concerned with. Is concerned with the problem of power. The question is how to get rid of the church as an instrument of power that prevent Russian peasants and workers, but mostly peasants, from engaging in a revolutionary activity. Right? Yeah, I need to go. But so the argumentation that I've just given, that is, in fact, it's a way of fighting against religion. That's exactly what it is. So you have to have a speculative form of materialism because there are religions. That's exactly what Lenin basically says in various ways. But anyway, it's not very satisfactory because we have not explained why fighting ideas help fighting powers. So we can just take that for granted, of course, and we could say that it's necessary to undermine the ideas of the people you want to fight. But in doing that, we have presupposed that ideas do matter. You might reply, well, okay, but why not? After all, Lenin is not a philosopher, so maybe he can presuppose, well, he's a philosopher, but he's a materialist philosopher, so he doesn't need to explain everything in a speculative way, after all. We could be content with that. But in fact, we can't, because fighting empirical criticism matter for the same reason as fighting a wrong conception of the relation between fighting for ideas and fighting powers matter. If fighting the wrong ideas help fighting the powers that use them, then we must not accept an understanding of the relation between speculative ideas and life-changing activities that is based on wrong ideas. Why? Because they will actually contribute to the power we are trying. So if you have a non-materialist understanding of your materialist speculation, according to Lenin's own standards, that would actually get you into trouble. So here we have a materialist reason for a speculative understanding of materialism itself. We have good reasons to try to build a good concept of materialism that is based on materialist reasons. And it's important here to remark, though, that religion is central because it makes of ideas something that are built in institutional infrastructures. That's something that I'm not staying on, but it's very important to understand why religion is so central to philosophy, because it makes of ideas institutions in some way. So it goes back to things you mentioned. So true love, maybe, is philosophy, in fact. But let's quickly move to Althusser. So providing this understanding of concepts, of the concept of materialism itself that is missing in Lenin's work is exactly, I think, what Althusser tried to do. And it's also worth noting that what I am doing here is very similar to what Althusser himself tried to do in his work, in the work from the 60s, except that he asked himself what concept of contradiction was already at work in given materialist practices, be they in politics or in scientific practices, while I am wondering what practice of speculation was already at work in the materialist practices, if you see the nuance. So he took for granted that we needed a concept. Well, he didn't take it entirely for granted, but he sort of took for granted that we needed a concept, a good concept of contradiction that would be the real materialist concept of contradiction. I don't take that for granted, so I try to precisely introduce this clarification or this speculative engagement. Because, in fact, Althusser could be rightly called a speculative materialist. That's what he is. I mean, that's exactly what he's doing. What he called theory is another word for speculation. So why has Althusser felt the need to intervene as a philosopher in the course of materialism? Or rather, this is a little too subjective, what are the non-philosophical reality of this philosophical action that he undertook? So Althusser's decision to become, if it might be called a decision, or Althusser becoming a materialist, Althusser materialism as a becoming, is inseparable from his decision to join the party. You cannot be a materialist, for Althusser, if you don't join the party, or at least some party, the side of the workers, the organized side of the workers. And again, to belong to an organization is to give yourself the real power, and to give to ideas power. So that's the same reason. But then he sets himself this major criterion, and I think he will never renounce that criterion. The materialist criterion is very simple. It says, and it's made very clear in the letter to Jean Lacroix, instead of asking whether something is true, a claim is true or not, you should ask yourself whether this truth helps the men and women who are involved in a radical transformation of our collective history, those people who make history, or if it doesn't. That's the real question. It's the only question. It's not whether it's true or not. This way of surrendering to the organicity of the party, to building a collective force, has some kind of tragic element. And the latter is a defense of the Moscow trials. Right? So it's, I don't want to hide the fact that there is a tragic element. But so here again, we have to refrain from conceptualizing too quickly. So we can remark that the materialist criterion brings whatever is argued to real forces, brings it back to real forces of the world. And the question then, for me, would be to understand why a speculative clarification of the concept of materialism would strengthen, would help building a collective force. What kind of collective body, to name it by its name, it's a body. What kind of collective body would be actually fostered by the speculative work? And here, Althusser's answer is unambiguous. Speculation, or if you wish, philosophy, is necessary because otherwise materialism is in danger of falling into horrible traps, which are nothing but ways of stitching, ways of conflating matter, or that condition, if you want, with particular planes of experience or regions of reality, like, for instance, the technology, the economy, and other situations. In fact, he says it's Lysenkoism that was that woke him up. It's l'affaire Lysenko. I don't know if you say in English affaire, actually. You remember that Lysenkoism was based on the idea that genetics must not be true because it negates the heritability of acquired characteristics, which means to negate the power of revolution to change life, if you want to make it quick. And this is a disaster in all respects, because it drew the attention of people of goodwill, I would say, to the difficulty of subjecting ideas to Kleist's criteria. So Althusser then opposes all forms of reductionism. Basically, the enemy is reductionism. That will reduce matter to any particular plane, be it revolutionary practice, that is leftism, or scientific practices, and that would be positivism. And leftism is very common, at least in my world. I don't know. Positivism is less common currently, but leftism is very common. That is the idea that the ultimate truth of the, or the ultimate criterion of the worth of what you're doing as a philosopher is whether it helps people fighting the cops. That's leftism, basically. And I mean, there is something to say about that, but to reduce it to that might be also a problem. So this is what Etienne called the heteronomy of the heteronomy. He said that about politics, but we can use it about philosophy. Yes, philosophy is heteronomy, but the heteronomy itself is heteronomous. So it's impossible to reduce it to any particular object. And well, Judith Butler had the same kind of argument in Bodies That Matter, where she shows that the very concept of matter is conditioned by gender issues, which is a way of saying, well, in fact, there is a heteronomy of your heteronomy. You're always the heteronymous of someone else. Well, this, I think, is actually where materialism should, and has, rebuilt itself with Althusser. So I'm going to be very quick so that I should end very quickly. Yeah, so almost an hour, half an hour, so. But, so the idea is the following. If we still want to hold to the idea that thought is determined, that it comes second, but nonetheless we don't know and we don't want to know what would be the cause in general, matter, we are left with the possibility of describing the cause in formal ways, in conceptual ways. This is, I think, what Althusser did. That is, it tries to build a philosophical system describing the cause. And you know what that cause is? It's called structure. Why? Well, in fact, materialism is structuralism. And why? Well, because that cause is absent, which means that it's not another element in the same realm of experience, but something that organizes the realm of experience without being part of it. So it's an absent cause, but it is a cause, nonetheless. And so just very quickly, the structure of the French language is not part of the French language, right? Nonetheless, it is the structure of the French language. It's not something else. It's not somewhere else. It's in the constitutive, the word has been used yesterday. It's in the constitutive donation of language itself. It's not somewhere else. It's not another plane of reality. Just like Lacan's unconscious is not another plane of reality. It is the structure of it. So this is a general strategy, plus another very important thing. It's what Althusser calls overdetermined, which means, in fact, equivocal. What does that mean? It means that each time concepts unfold into other concepts, something else is happening at the same time somewhere else, which doesn't mean that it can be reduced. You have both. You just have both, so it's overdetermined. This is structure too, because a structure is something just like it's made of signs, and signs are twofold. A sign is a signifier and signified. So it's defined in a network, in at least two networks. So this is, I think, why Althusser was actually very justified to introduce the structuralist concept in materialism. And there are other reasons, but I won't want to go through all of them to convince you that, in fact, structuralism is the solution, at least for some part. So I will stop here just to just before I entirely conclude. So, of course, what will remain would be here to explain what kind of philosophical method would come out of that. So what does it mean to be a structuralist in philosophy once you've said that structuralism is materialism? And Althusser didn't do that, but I think Etienne does. And I will just give a very quick idea. Why? Well, because, you know, Etienne speaks of aporias all the time. Yes, Etienne, you even say that you were a structuralist in that text called The Infinite Contradiction, which is an introduction to all your work, but in other places, of course. But so why? Because something that has not been very often, I think, remarked in Etienne's work is that, so what does he do when he does philosophy? Well, basically, he shows that different philosophical propositions are linked to one another around an aporetic distributive structure. So some people find that very sad. And why that guy telling you that there is no solution? Well, he's saying that because the solution is not conceptual. If there is a solution, the solution must be found and will be found outside. So this, I think, is a very structuralist method. It's actually the method that I think Foucault used in The Order of Things. And I would call that a method where you try to exhaust all the intellectual possibilities in which you are, to make them impossible. So you don't try to provide tools. You're, on the contrary, trying to make people realize that they don't have the right tools, so that they can create intellectual tools in the wake of their, or in the course of their practice. So this, I think, is indeed an example of a materialist practice in philosophy itself. This is very important because we are in a time where a lot of people say that we need to overcome post-structuralism, overcome different philosophy in the name of materialism or realism. And I would simply say, yes, we need to do justice to speculation, but we need to do that in a way where speculation is actually a real power in the world. Thank you.
It works? Yes. So, thank you very much to be there with you. We all are very happy, and me particularly. It works, yeah? Yeah. So, my paper is on overdetermination. It's a good occasion. Or more precisely, in the relation in Balibar's work between inconvertible violence, contingency, universality, and why the problematic on overdetermination in Freud and in Althusser has to do with the problem of conversion of violence. In Violence and Civility, there are 4 affirmations that give us a fresh perspective on politics. The first is to affirm, by methodically taking distance from Hegel's thought, that there is something inconvertible in the transformation that the classical theorist hoped for, social violence in right and in civility. The second affirmation is that we should have a resolutely non-moral way of thinking about the foundation or the non-foundation of the political. On this point, I think, but it's not the general reading of Balibar, on this point, Hegel remains a decisive reference, the critique of the morality and perhaps of the ethic. The third affirmation is that the diverse register of communal life that the Politik unifies are organized otherwise than what Hegel tells us. For example, the male subject supposes separation from the family, who will be integrated into civil and political society, and who buys the right to desire by cutting himself off from the affective substantiality, in fact, commands the entire distribution of gendered roles in this construction. Now, arbitrary construction leaves out other forms of separation, transition, and exclusion that distribute gender in societies. Or other examples, when Balibar says that the problematic of conversion in Hegel has to do always with how the private is used or is experienced to make something else as private in the state, in the public state. When he said that the only way to show how the individuals are linked to history, to politics and history, is sacrifice, in the figure, for example, of Antigone, or in the figure of the renouncement of any subjectivity during the terror. Fourth affirmation, the political is a domain of collective existence that precisely demand that we take leave from a fundamentalist way of thinking. I don't know if it's materialism. Certainly Machiavelli had said this, but without making the link to the question of violence between the importance of contingent factor in which violence transforms into civility and the impossibility of founding the political on an essential truth that reality would accomplish, there is a mutual implication. I have 3 points, but I will develop in a broader manner only the third. My first point is stop measuring the real against the ideal. I don't know if it's realism or materialism. We can discuss that. The second point is property a good form for political relation? And how can we read Hegel on that point? And the third point is overdetermination and contingency in Balibar, in Freud, and in Althusser. In this respect, the text published by Etienne Balibar over the past 10 years are of particular interest to me, since I am working on showing that the same goes for psychoanalysis as social practice that intervenes in the field of sexuated unconscious. The relation between contingency and determination in the formation and the exercise of sexuality greatly resembles what Balibar describes. In psychoanalysis, we try not to measure the reality on the sexual against a norm, which would be the telos of treatment. We start from the impasses and the gaps in existence, the transposition of what is at stake in conscious into the very particular condition of the treatment has for its function to loosen the grip of the vice by which symptoms are formed, considered as a provisional style of life. We start from what isn't working. Nous partons de ce qui ne va pas. And we undo the note so that they can be formed differently. We don't know a priori what is good for such and such a patient. In the same way, Balibar no longer measures a state of nature that would be violent against its conversion into a civil state, as was the case in Hobbes and Rousseau. He no longer hopes, as was the case in Hegel, that the negativity of violence would have by itself the ontological power to negate itself, nor that this self-negation of destruction would be the very process of history. I think that the topography of the two forms of extreme violence has as its function to look at the reality of our political world from the epoch of nation-states and after, without nostalgia, but by giving itself the means to situate the danger, to make a diagnostic in the sense of Foucault. This topography of extreme violence, the objective and the subjective, is to think how we can build space between the danger of a short circuit. And therefore I said that it's something else as an ethical point of view. And I think that in the context of United States and in the context of Europe, and particularly in the years of, we can say, Althusser, this point was for us very important. I don't know if we succeed. I don't know where we are now on this problem. Are the political question independent from ethical perspective or not? In some texts, Balibar speaks from the possibility of politics. And is that possibility related to common condition or with this ethical, under-politic or sub-politic question, I think, I do not think exactly how you could give a response to that question. Secondly, does property convert violence? If there is some inconvertible violence in social and political relations, it follows that the entire edifice or hanging together of different registers of human life capable of structuring themselves into a state is disrupted. I would like to suggest here that another kind of challenge to this hierarchy internal to political philosophy is possible. I will do so by distancing myself from Hegel in accordance with Balibar's method, but on a different point. Balibar, emphasizing the anthropological presupposition of the construction of state, refers only, as many philosophers of the politics, refers only to the third part of elements of philosophy. That is to say, the part in which Hegel puts the family and the society of labor in relation with a properly political relation in the theory of state. The state, which seems to be the result from the other spheres, and which, however, supports the family and the society of labor. This is the foundation of the idealism in Hegel. But in this reading, curiously, it's never a question of the first part of Hegel's work, abstract right, that is to say, the right of property. And I think that we couldn't read the first part of this book as a theory of inadequacy to the right of property to give a form to the social life, and therefore it fails. But he is very precise, Hegel, in describing each time how the right of property fails. And I mean something else as the problematic of conversion. It's a problematic of the inadequacy. Hegel's entire analysis shows the indigence of property, not only in its transformation in society of work, in the civil society, the confrontation of a will with a thing whose will affirms that it belongs to it, and the act by which wills mutually guarantee this identity between wills and things, shows itself to be inadequate. They demonstrate by this very inadequation the wealth, Hegel says, the concrete character of social relations which precisely do not result in a trickling down in the form, in a trickling, I lost my paper, in a trickling down in the form of property. There is a violence that is likely not an extreme violence, but which is certainly objective in Balibar's sense. We could even so far as to say that this inability of property to produce the form of social relation simply proves that it belongs only to an inferior rationality, as Hegel would say, like the still mechanical rationality of competition in the sphere of labor. But there is more. Is this confrontation, it works or not? Yes? Sometimes. Is this confrontation of wills and inanimate things not precisely animist? Great care? Okay. No. Recall that in the savage mind, Lévi-Strauss saw a totemic ceremony in the visits that family make to an attorney's office following a death. What is inheritance if not a magic of things that is supposed to guarantee the persistence of a person by way of objects, even despite death? I am here only, I would say that we must reread the first part of this book of Hegel to understand how is the conversion of violence the only way to think the relation between individuals and public spheres. And this theory of inadequation could be the only way, or not the only way, one way to describe the positivity of social and political relations, because they don't enter in the form of property. And now, contingency and overdetermination. In reading the English version of Violence and Civility, I remarked that Balibar sometimes uses of the term of contingency, sometimes hazard, and sometimes chance, and aleatory factor. And I think we can be more precise in the use of these concepts. And therefore, I will, in my field, that is to say the psychoanalytical practice and theory, I will be more precise on what I mean with what means contingency. Balibar's insistence on the role of contingency in the possibility or impossibility that violence converts into civility gives me the opportunity to put the concept of contingency in dialogue with the concept of contingency I tried to clarify in the field of psychoanalysis. In Eloge, in praise of contingency in sexual life, I maintain that psychoanalysis puts forward a very specific concept of contingency, impossible to inscribe in philosophical traditions, even perhaps in aleatory materialism of late Althusser. In the field of transference, contingent elements are picked up by or invented by the analysant in a signifying relation very close to the element of necessity. These contingent elements become capable of transforming what repeats itself with the necessity and with extreme violence, and with extreme violence, and become capable to make of this repetition a reinvention of existence. We can employ in this way the Lacanian vocabulary that shows how transference transforms the symptom into a symptom. But we can also describe this process in another way, so that symptoms are converted into the invention of a style of life instead of remaining an impediment to living. There has to be, thanks to the transposition of subjective impasses, new element that it's necessary that new element intervene. Now, these new elements are contingent. dream made in transference, and that remodel the signifier of a history, but not only the signifier of the history, the modality of living, have this peculiar quality of being borrowed from the very materials of repetition, but also of diverting from them. From the point of view of a solely formal logic, contingency is opposed to necessity. But from the point of view of a transcendental logic without a priori categories, transcendental logic without a priori categories, that is to say, like in archaeology of knowledge, Foucault speaks of a priori historique. I think that it has to do with this problematic. A set of statements has a logical organization, but this organization is not independent of the empirical field. So I think it's the same in the logic of a cure. It's something else as a pure formal logic, for example, in the formularies of sexuation by Lacan. It's a transcendental logic without a priori categories. So from that point of view, contingency borrows from necessity. This is why it can change the course of it. I have described many examples in the book I have cited. I don't make this in order to be not too long. Does the clinical field of transference, where the particularity of the relations between the contingent and the necessary are knotted together, and in fact, through the organization of the drives and through the reorganization, the transference made possible, does this clinical field where necessity and contingency are formed in the same material field, have nothing to do with the logic of the political and of history. On the contrary, I mean. Balibar affirms that for a situation of political violence to turn in civility, there are to be elements heterogeneous and exterior to violence itself. Hegel thought that the destructivity of violence negated itself immanently, and that history was the very process of this conversion. Balibar thinks that violence do not have the immanent power to convert themselves. There must be measures or events or organization that separate ultra-objective violence from ultra-subjective violence, and that the putting into place of this organization appeals to exterior, heterogeneous, and contingent factors. Politics, I quote, "Politics is not rare," Balibar writes, in discussion, I mean, with Rancière, thank you, but precarious. Let's go over the history of this relation between contingency and heterogeneity of factors that transform a political situation. We will go back to Althusser, 1962. We have in mind, I have, how many times I have? I began a little later. No, 5? No, 10. We have in mind, the appeal Althusser made to Freud's Traumdeutung in the chapter 4 marks, contradiction of and overdetermination. What interested him there was to understand with Lenin why the Bolshevik Revolution had taken place in Russia and not in Germany, where everybody expected it. Germany was the most advanced country in the development of capitalism, the country where the principal contradiction of the mode of production was the most affirmed and where the political class struggle, opposing the proletariat to the bourgeoisie, had found a remarkable political expression. Now, these are precisely factors exterior to the so-called principal contradiction that rendered it politically efficacious. In exceptional sector where capitalism was established in Russia, the modernism of the system was all the more clear when it was a question of this exceptionally advanced sector. For the rest, Russia was made up almost exclusively of peasants uncatered by capitalism. So, these two factors and the apparently different position have were a revolutionary catalyst. And the problem is if there is always exterior factor who render efficacious, useful, the supposed principal contradiction. Let's compare this to what Freud says. He introduces what is, in fact, overdetermination in Freud. He introduces overdetermination in the chapter on dream work, which examines, starting from the practice of free association induced by transference, how we can conceive of the relation between the thought that the dream stirs up and the dream story. The dream work is the set of bridges that let us understand the relation between these two languages. But are there really complete languages? That is not sure. Overdetermination, there are two determinations of overdetermination in Freud. Overdetermination can first be described from a structural point of view. The correspondence between manifest and latent content is organized system by system. But I am not sure if it's exactly in the structuralist way. The problem is if we start off from an element of the manifest content, it leads to a plurality of elements of the latent context, but these elements, through their internal relation in the association, establish link between elements in the manifest content. This is overdetermination. Overdetermination is a set of relation between the two registers. But there is something else in overdetermination. The latent dream, and it has to do with intensities. The latent dream is, he said, differently centered than the manifest dream. What shows itself to be decisive in the analysis had first appeared secondary in the telling of the dream. Instead of seeing this displacement of intensity in a negative light, Freud locates there the expression of the power of a power to put into form which makes possible the event of the dream by circumventing the sensor. So, The problem is, if I will be quickly, not too long, is that Althusser sometimes says, and Balibar says it more clearly, that there is no principal contradiction, rather that it is always a contingent event that make what is given plays a principal role. And this especially is especially pertinent for extreme violence, which does not convert immanently into civility. And it is indeed at this point that it is worth taking distance from Hegel, despite his genius, since it is on the subject of violence that he affirmed the capacity of negativity to transform itself. So my question, by way of conclusion to Etienne Balibar, would be, I said that in psychoanalysis, the contingent factor is made up of a near transposition of the very material of the necessary. I must take an example, but we don't have time, of this question of materiality in the proximity of necessity and contingency. Transposition, which gives a chance to elements apparently without importance, but that become decisive precisely because they, being of little importance, introduces play by thwarting resistance. Whereas overdetermination produces its work of subtle weaving between the insignificant and the decisive. Do the same go for political initiatives that can thwart the short circuit between extreme objective violence and extreme subjective violence? How can we invent subtle gaps in relation to the necessary in politics?
Thank all three of the speakers. I think we have some time for discussion. I believe we have until 11:20 until the break. So we have a half hour or so. Yes.
So I have a question of clarification for Judy and a question for Patrice. You said, Judy, that love and law are the performative features of God. And what I want to know is about the relationship between love and law. And the reason I want to know, what I want to know is there any difference? And the reason I want to know that is because you said at the end that religion was to be understood in terms of practices. I understand practices as rule-governed practices, therefore as law. So my question is there any difference between love and law? There must be, but are you arguing for their intimation? It's just a question of further exposition. Patrice, so you said something that shocked me. Your fundamental definition of materialism sounded to me idealist. You said materialism is when thought is taken to be the continuation of the production of the world.
Say it again.
That materialism is the claim that thought is nothing more than the continuation of the production of the world. And that thesis holds for Schelling, for Hegel, for Schopenhauer, for Nietzsche, for Merleau-Ponty, for Wittgenstein, for Hölderlin. So it holds for a lot of people. So first my puzzle is, how can a definition of materialism be equally true for idealists? And my second question, because I don't mind that definition, I actually like it a lot, so it's not critical, I think it's probably right, but then my understanding of how the mechanism works is different than your structuralist one. So I guess I would instance the Merleau-Ponty version, right, in his Lukács, great Lukács essay, where he says history, right, is itself the production of ideas, which at certain moments rise to the level of philosophy, only then to press itself into history. That sounds to me like a critical materialism without either speculation or any of the other issues, and yet it has all the power of critique. So I don't know why structuralism came in. So that was, yeah.
Well, I mean, briefly, Jay, I don't think all rule-governed action is governed by law. I think the distinction between rules and law is a really important one, especially, I think, in sociological analysis, and we could even turn to Bourdieu to get, you know, a quite elaborate distinction. Let me just clarify that I'm offering a reading of Balibar reading Spinoza, so I'm trying to track the logic of those various positions and entering into that language as a way of unfolding its imminent development, and then, of course, asking about what that illuminates in some contemporary debates about secularism. So if you were to say, you, Judith Butler, what is your view on love and law? I mean, I would just say, I'm sorry, you misunderstand my, I don't have a view on love and law. I mean, maybe I should, but I do, it's a difference between offering a reading, which I think has and putting forth a positive position that could be extracted from the text and then becomes my own.
I was just hypnotized by the fact that God should manifest himself in those two performances.
Well, there's more. I mean, you know, there's love, law, and nature.
Yes.
Really.
Yeah.
And that becomes, I think, extremely interesting. But I do think that that God is not, at least for Spinoza, is not only with the command structure.
Right.
So we have command structure, which is one form of law, but we also have rule-governed social and embodied action, which is not to be understood as deterministically determined. I have to use the word twice in order to avoid the ambiguity. So that seems very very different, and I think freedom and rule are linked together in a different way. But I also think, well, I think there's more to be said, but there are several theological traditions that converge in the Spinozistic text, which is why he can be called a pagan, why he can be called a Christian, and why he can be called a Jew. Or a pantheist, really. Pantheist pagan.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, there's probably, it was ill-phrased because my proposition that, so first the materialist postulation or the materialist idea is ideas come second.
Yeah.
That's what it is, right?
Right.
That's,
We're
so it's,
agreed.
then, indeed, if you try to unfold that, one of the traits of this idea would be that to think is not to represent the world, but it is linked to an event in progress, as they say in the elevator, an event in progress. And which doesn't mean you're right here. You're right that that might be misunderstood as if it meant that thinking does the job. No, it simply means that thinking is taken in something, which is a continuation of the world, or whatever it is, or something else, And of course, then you're right. So that actually, then we have to add other traits, and one of those traits was that thought is independent, or that it's caused by something that is radically heterogeneous, radically different from it. And that, of course, excludes Hegel to a certain extent. Yeah, in fact. But to exclude Hegel, you would need a little bit more, but you do actually. Yeah. In the end, for Hegel, the heterogeneity of let's say idea and being is taken in the process of the idea itself. You can complicate a lot Hegel, but I think you will not take that off without making it the dialectical method. That's at least Althusser's claim, and I think it's very convincing. In the end, must be idealist because it's teleological. But that's another. So it has to do with contingency and that kind of issues. But it's a tough. But then Merleau-Ponty is an interesting case. But let's yeah, there are other traits. That's all I can say. And you're right. But history, Lukács. The problem is that when you say history as a name for these heterogeneous elements, which would be determinant in the last instance. In fact, you already say too much. That's why I think we should keep the word that Deleuze uses. We should call it the outside. Why? Well, because you can have actually non-historical time. You can have non-historical changes. And Lévi-Strauss's anthropology showed that you can have actually transformations and becomings that are non-historical, and that history, you could even put the argument very simply. Chakrabarty, that was mentioned yesterday actually, to an extent can be taken to say that history is just one way of understanding change. It's one variant of change itself. So outside would be better than history. You see, that's where the structuralist element comes in. That is, the only thing you can say is that it's a cause, but it's absent, it's prior, it's overdetermined, and so on and so on. But to name it like matter, history, or whatever, would be too much, actually. That's why structuralism is good there, because it's formal.
Maybe if you stand up,
I'm Thomas Lewis from Religious Studies. Thank you very much to all of the panelists. My question is for Professor Butler, and I just wanted to say first that I enjoyed so many different of the contributions in the talk. I wanted to focus on this issue of the concept of religion and your claim that religion is not a concept, and try to get a more precise picture of exactly what the claim is. So obviously the kind of background for the claim, as you note, is figures like Salomon Blue, Talal Asad, who've argued for the ways in which notions of practice have been absent, or at least far marginalized in much contemporary discussion of religion.
Give him a mic.
I can also project Thank you. Is that better? I also have a cold that doesn't help. Is that working? Okay. So with regard to the concept of religion, part of the key background is the recent discussions about the marginalization of practices of embodiment in much modern Western discussion of religion. One response to that is obviously to elaborate a new concept of religion in ways that seek to include embodiment and practice in certain ways. I take it that you want to reject that move. I mean, I would associate that move with someone like Bruce Lincoln, But I take it that you would reject that in favor of a claim that any such efforts to move religion into a concept involve the loss of the sedimentation of meanings and so forth. But I'm wondering, is that specific to religion, or might we say much the same thing about democracy not being a concept, liberalism not being a concept for the same kinds of reasons? So is the reason that religion is not a concept specific to something about religion, or a broader claim about these complex terms and their sedimented meanings? Sorry. Thank you.
Well, I think one of the ways in which the conceptual status of religion becomes important in a way that's different from other kinds of concepts like liberalism or gender.
For instance.
It's nice talking about it in the third person. Anyway, sorry. I'm just enjoying myself. It's very dangerous. No, seriously, one of the reasons it is such a problem is because, well, look, there are two sets of debates that you no doubt know about, and one of them has to do with whether philosophy was able successfully to distinguish itself from religion in the early modern period. So even if we just go through Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, we find that this debate is a very active one. And the question, one of the major questions, is whether religion can come under the concept and be understood as a stage in the elaboration of a concept that finally allows philosophy to achieve superiority and also be the means through which religion gains its final clarification, right? And of course, there are people who have worked on this to show that even in that moment in which philosophy claims that it has achieved through the concept the final superiority over religion, appropriating it and subordinating it, it is haunted by religious meanings or traces of religious notions that it can't fully overcome. So my own former student, Alex Dubélé, has written extensively on this very tension between philosophy and religion in German idealism. Actually, it's dating back to Meister Eckhart. And I'm hoping, it's great there's a Fordham editor here. I'm hoping Fordham is publishing that excellent book. So that's one reason why there's a very specific, and I wouldn't say ancient quarrel, but at least early modern and modern quarrel that's important to take into account. I think the other, it would be naive to say that religion is not a concept. There are people who treat it as a concept, and it functions in the world as a concept, and Henk de Vries has done a great deal of really important work on that. And his work is also work that I follow and treasure, quite frankly. So it's not as if I'm in this debate exactly, but I do feel the necessity to track it precisely because there is no settled conclusion. I follow Talal Asad and Saba Mahmood and Charles Hirschkind and others who are trying to think about religion as practice and embodiment. It's theoretical work. It may not be conceptual. And there's a distinction between a rigorous theoretical inquiry into embodiment versus a concept of the body that we can work with quite apart from its historical and practical resonances. So, I think there's a distinction between the concept, between theoretical work, between historical work with strong theoretical implications. And I just think we have to be mindful that this is a contested field. The other thing I would just add is that whenever I have gone to speak in religious studies programs, it is almost always the case that there's religious studies over here and there's theology over here. And they fight. They fight the way philosophy department fights. Is this going to be an appointment in theology, or is it going to be an appointment in religious studies? And religious studies people are asking all these questions about embodiment and ritual and social meanings. And theology people are doing sometimes work that's even more interesting to me, like, oh, let's read Spinoza together. I mean, I care about theology quite deeply, but the institutional affiliation with religious institutions, right, that is very often implied by theology, always gives it that, that problematic political character. So, you know, the radical Democrats tend to, not always, be in religious studies unless you're in Latin America, right? At which point, you're the whole, you know, you've got revolutionary theology, which is anti-statist. But so it's important to be able to track these things, which is why I think a concept of religion is going to make us a single concept, surely, or an insistence that it is only to be understood at the conceptual level. I think we don't get to actually understand these super important, actually urgent kinds of political and historical questions.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going to keep you on the same train you were just on.
Yeah,
I was going to
I
ask
knew
almost
my-
exactly
my
the same question.
Columbia friends
Sorry.
would speak up.
Hi.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'm curious if you want about the general question involved in what looks like, if you want, a self-defensive gesture of saying, no, I'm embodied practices, so you can't call me a concept. And the fact that various other people in various situations might well make the same move, financial speculators or pedophiles or, you know, whatever, you know. What we have is embodied practices. And don't translate this into, I'm sorry, it's not a completely unserious question, but I was actually thinking about the status that Foucault gave to literature, which seems to me analogous in some way. When he left literature out of his sort of order of discourse, partly because he liked it so much. And he wanted to say, it throws the order of discourse into question. So don't tell me that it's, you know, just another part of that order. And we literary people said, that's great. And then we thought, actually, maybe it's not so great. You know? If you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know, I guess I offered this up as an analogy for you to do with what you will.
Well, I want to preface this by saying that I adore you and I adore your contestations. I adore your objections, and I like it that they're outrageous and maybe, you know, not as buttoned up as they should be. But no, let me say this. I mean, I think one of the problems is that if we imagine that this is a debate between those who think conceptually and rigorously and those who are referring to the immediacy of the body as preconceptual, we are misunderstanding that debate. That is not what's going on. Okay, there are theories of embodiment. There are theoretical ways of thinking about embodiment as relationality, embodiment in practice and as practice. There are theoretical ways of thinking about ethics as an embodied relation, and we can find those in Western and non-Western contexts. There are all kinds of ways of thinking about ethical relations and even faith or religion in non-cognitive ways, which does not make them irrationalist or purely affective. I think that as long as we continue to be in that kind of binary opposition, we're not thinking well about thinking about where and how it takes place. So, you know, when I consider Saba Mahmood's reflections on ethical relationality, she is actually trying to understand how a certain practice of the body can be related to ideals and images that are inscribed in texts and that require certain forms of reading practices and certain forms of ethical practices, and what the relationship is between the two. I mean, we would call that hermeneutics, you know, if we're in a good mood, if we're in a generous mood. If we're in it is not a kind of, it's not a pure reference to the immediacy of the body. So, you know, sometimes when you say body, people think, oh, immediacy, you know, and I think that's part of like a very bad Cartesian inheritance that we should be rethinking and challenging in the most important ways. I even think Spinoza gives us some ways to think about embodied freedom and ethical practice as embodied freedom that is very important. It's not purely cognitive, it's not purely voluntarist, it's not purely individualist, it's relational, it's embodied, and it's social. And I would also say that for Mahmood as well, she has a different version, but it's relational, it's embodied, and it's social. And it's actually also involved in certain forms of interpretation, and then we get to have a debate about what kind. I know you disagree, but we're just going to have this fight.
I'm sorry. I didn't disagree about any of that. Why does that somehow slip you free of the conceptual? That's true about so many things.
It does not slip you free of the theoretical. But if you think that it depends on, well, first of all, I don't know how this particular group works, but in the world I live in, you know, if you're talking about the concept, you might be talking about Hegel, you might be talking about Kant, you might be talking about Whitehead, you might be talking about Koselleck. Where's he anyway? Like he's kind of brilliant on this. Anyway, you might be talking about you might be talking about fights in philosophy departments right now where they're refusing philosophy of language in the name of conceptual analysis. Why? Because we have direct relations to concepts and we don't even have to think about the language in which they're formed because that language falls away and Wittgenstein is dead. So, you know, it's going to be really hard for me to like sign up for the concept under those conditions, right? And those are the embattled conditions in which most philosophy departments are living right now. So I would want to, which language game of the concept are we in here, I would say, Wittgensteinian, you know, troublemaker. I think this is a really important question because, you know, if we're following German idealism and the way in which, say, Hent makes use of that to try to bring religion into the conceptual, then we're immediately involved in a whole set of very interesting debates, some of which I've tried to indicate here. And we should have those debates.
Tim, unless you want to speak to Anne, who's on the same topic.
Oh, I'm also on the same topic.
Yes,
Okay,
go
so-
ahead, Tim.
Go ahead, Tim.
Should I go to
I also have a question for Monique when we have a moment.
Well, it seemed to me that all three of you were I love the panel and the way that they talk to each other. I thought all three of you were making a certain point about the about the political concept, which is to say the political concept is an oxymoron. Is an oxymoron. And you were each putting forward different terms to bring the political and the concept into relation. I mean, Patrice, it seemed to me you put two terms, introduced two terms. One was materialist from Althusser, it was the term party. The other the other term was a philosophical term from Balibar, aporia. And in a sense, that those are the terms that were doing the work of leaping across the gap between politics and the concept. Judith, I thought that, I mean, you've said already a lot about what you were doing, but the notion of true religion indicates to me that the term that was doing that work is in some sense truth. I mean, you know, what is truth? And I was thinking a lot during your talk also about the other figure that you don't talk about, which is Kierkegaard, and Kierkegaard and the concept of the either-or, and the concept that in Kierkegaard's work sort of squares the either with the or is in fact fiction, in a sense, these pseudonymous narrators that he adopts. So in fact, truth and fiction seem to me, in a sense, the two terms that are doing that work in relationship to the category of religion. And then for Monique, I thought that obviously you're doing work with contingency, with chance, with the aleatory, but the term that you brought into conversation through psychoanalysis seems to be transference, but also transposition. Was I hearing you right? So I wanted to ask you whether transposition, the party, aporia, truth, fiction, were in some sense the same for you three.
Yes. Übertragung in German. In Übertragung, you can hear tragen, and tragen in another place. So, in French, we don't hear anymore in transfer the term ferro, the Latin ferro. But when you read Laplanche et Pontalis, they said transference, first, it's a question of representation, displacement of representation. It's not a question of materiality. They know that, for example, in France, in French, you can speak from transfert de fonds. There is something material. You put money from one place to another, and it's not the same institution. So I think that we must translate Übertragung with transposition, because the sexual life and the unconscious component don't function on the same condition in life and in the special condition of analysis. It's a changing of the material and institutional condition of life and death and drives.
So we have Pam, and then Gary Wilder, and then we're going to let Etienne have the last word.
So I want to say something that's really,
Sorry?
Can't they answer my question?
Oh,
Yes.
sorry.
I really want to say something that speaks to sort of what this political concepts project is about. And I want to say that it is precisely not the political concept, even as it joined, is an oxymoron in any way. In fact, it's only an oxymoron if you subscribe, it seems to me, to a rather rigid notion within philosophy of where concept work resides, who can do it, who has a right to it, what concepts look like. For me, the whole point of doing this venture together has been that political concept has to open the space for precisely all of those sedimented meetings, and it's not just in Koselleck's already confined sense of the political, but opening the very, very possibility of where the political lies and when it happens. And it seems to me what we want to be doing and what we need to be thinking with is not within the rigid confines of a really canonical philosophy, but of all the other spaces and all the other vernaculars in which concept work is happening all of the time. And one of the people I think with on this is Pierre Machary, who offers us not that it's the rigidity of holding on to this confined, constricted space, but of the very fragility and the filiations that concept. Those are the two words that ring so hard for him. So instead of going with this is where the concept is, you know, there's been a slippage here. We talk about the concept, then we talk about the political concept. They're not the same. And the kind of venture that I feel that we've been thinking of very much with Adi, thinking about that performative moment of the political concept is a very specific kind of making and claiming on what can be political and what can be within the conceptual domain.
You know, I have questions for Judith and Monique.
Oh, we need the mic.
I'll yield. No, I'll yield because I think Etienne needs to talk on these three papers because they. I mean, I appreciate very much Annie's comment, and it kind of clears the air for me. I was going to go to Philo of Alexandria, and I was going to, you know, which maybe it seems a little bit too much of a PS at this point. But I am interested in Philo because for him, the whole question, this is why I think that if we stay even with Spinoza, we go back as far as Spinoza, we think we're really digging deep into the Western canon, but it goes back a lot further than that. And if you look at Philo of Alexandria, he's got this wonderful problem, which after Kant, we haven't even thought about, which is how do you relate truth to practice? And practice is embodied. So it's not the body versus the mind, the
It's
concept,
phronesis.
whatever. It's
It's
not
phronesis.
Descartes, right? It is how do you, and this I think is precisely, for me, reading Althusser and then reading Balibar in my own history of development, what Balibar gave me was a way out of this structural confinement and a reconnection between the first and second critique, that we can do practice at the same time we do truth. And, you know, that I think is something that too much of recent philosophy has just lost, that somehow if we're dealing with truth, we're not dealing with practice. And I never find that in Etienne.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a word about that discussion on the political and the conceptual, or as I like to say, the speculative. And so, yeah, I understand the point. No, I understand the point.
Political.
And the political, the relation between two. Actually, I don't think that there is an oxymoron. I think, on the contrary, what I was trying to do is to explain under what conditions, according to a certain language game, you could actually consider the speculative move as a political move, and even as making some space for politics. Just to give another intuition about that, it's a. But just before explaining that, yeah, it's true that there are concepts in the vernaculars, as you say, but to do what we seem to be doing here, that is to take a word very often. I mean, you can see at the list there are words, right? And to try to explicate that word by connecting it to other units of whatever language, maybe would be the right word, is a very special activity. So it's not the same as concepts operating and extracting those concepts and treating them for themselves, which is a speculative move, and it has something bizarre, in fact. That, you know, it's not necessary to do that. It's a particular practice, and we should be also aware of the singularity of that practice and of what we want to do with it. So I was trying basically to say there is one sense in which doing that kind of extraction is violent. It's a form of violence, and it does resonate with a certain notion of politics. So because precisely, and this is one of the arguments Althusser gives, why do we need speculation? Because because naturally we are anarcho-syndicalist, he says. We are reformists because, well, you need violence. And the speculative move would be a form of violence in its order. So I let you on that, right? Whether we agree on that or not. It's just one way, and there are others. It's just one way of understanding the relation between the conceptual and the political. There are others. But what we would do is a kind of anthropology of concepts. Anthropology of speculation. You understand that?
I I will just make an element of reference to Susan. And in order to think in another manner, pour penser autrement, we must have and do not oppose theory and practice. We must renew our concept of performativity, but also what is an operation and what is an operation in language in other fields without to talk, I think that now, without to talk from body and mind. We must find other concepts.
I think we're at, maybe we'll just end there. I was given